Okay. We're here with Professor Paul Romer, who has been at Stanford University for a very long time, and who has been repeatedly mentioned as a Nobel Prize winner because of his research on endogenous growth, more particularly linkage between technology and growth. And right now he's promoting the charter cities here in Honduras and in other countries. And you make reference to Hong Kong and Singapore. And this idea of having clear rules, and the British got to Hong Kong in 1842, and since then the English language was used as a means of doing business and public administration. The British were reputed for having the best colonial administration among all colonial powers. And then there was free trade from the beginning, and which is another like good rule, which you talk about good rules. And this thing was a consistent point throughout all the way till 1997, and actually it continues after it was given back to China. The thing is that economic historians cannot be precise about the rate of economic growth that Hong Kong had in, let's say, the 19th century, but they can make rough estimates. And they say that from 1842 to 1947, more than 100 years, the rate of economic growth of Hong Kong was very slow, like about 2% annually, despite all these things that Honduran charter cities will have. So the issue is, what's to say that Honduran charter cities will not spend 100 years growing at 2% annually? I say that because Honduras, since 1950 to the present, has attained a rate of economic growth of about 3.4% annually. So we already got a lot more than 2%. We don't need just 2%. We need something at least like 8 on a sustained basis. So what guarantee is it that we're not going to stagnate for about 100 years?
So the way to think about growth in Honduras is that there is a frontier of technology in the richest countries of the world, and Honduras is well behind that frontier. So you can grow very quickly as you catch up with the frontier. Hong Kong in 1840 wasn't as far behind Britain in 1840 or the US in 1840. It wasn't as far behind as Honduras is compared to the United States today or Europe today. So the big gap in technology, the big gap in income and productivity gives you a chance to grow very quickly as you adopt the rules and the technologies that lead to high income in these other countries.
I mean, I thought Hong Kong, before the British got there was nothing. There was just a pirate.
That's right.
A pirate hideout, sort of like Pirates of the Caribbean,
right.
The movie, and,
there was
and a bunch
there.
Of fishermen. There was nothing. So that means they were completely backward. So the catch-up phase was huge, even by the standards of Peking in that time. So why didn't they grow fast back then?
Remember, the gap in productivity was not as large. We also had not developed systems for having for example, a global supply chain, that when someone in the United States or England bought a good back in the 1870s, it was usually manufactured locally. Now we know how to outsource production all over the world, and firms can go anywhere. There are good logistics and people willing to work hard. So the modern technology for communications, modern organizations that can produce these global supply chains, modern transportation technologies, all of those make it much more feasible for Honduras to grow quickly as it catches up with the leaders.
Yeah, well, it presents the same problem with Singapore. It was taken by the Brits in 1819, and until then, there was nothing there. It was a forgotten island. That's why the Sultan back then traded so easily with Sir Raffles, because it was just empty space. There was nothing. So there was a huge catch-up, and yet from 1819 to 1899, this is an 80-year period. Rates of growth were below 2% annually. Once again, despite all these great rules about free trade, about an efficient British administration, about Thomas Raffles is seen as a visionary back then from the East India Company. And yet, there was slow growth. The fast growth started until Lee Kuan Yew got to power in 1959. And so are we going to be waiting 100 years until we get fast growth in these charter cities?
No, I'm firmly convinced that the modern experience of rapid catch-up growth in Japan after World War II, then in South Korea and Taiwan, in Hong Kong and Singapore, all in the post-World War II era, and China now, those are all the models that can be emulated and copied here in Honduras. And remember, the growth that you're speaking of is partly a function of population growth, how many people move to a place. And one of the problems in Singapore and Hong Kong was that they were pretty small centers. There wasn't enough people, there wasn't enough activity. So one of the challenges here will be to try and attract enough people to have a successful urban center that can become a hub for air transit and communications and manufacturing. But I think with the right rules, all of the people who currently leave Honduras, leave Central America to go work in cities in the United States, all of those people could quickly move to a place here.
Sure.
Well, just if there's an opportunity, if they could move someplace where they could be a legal resident and get a job in a factory, of course they would go there.
Yeah, but if there is fast growth, if there's not, there's nothing else.
It's the jobs that will cause the growth.
And isn't fast growth what delivers it? Because we have never had fast growth, and that's why there's a huge unemployment and their underemployment.
No, well, the question you should ask is, will Hondurans get jobs if they can move to this new city? And the answer is yes, if this city provides the logistics where manufacturers from all over the world could come run their operations here. So if there's good logistics, people willing to work, a safe and predictable legal environment, firms will come here, investors will build infrastructure, workers will go there, and the population will grow quickly, but then income per capita, per person, wages will grow as people get experience and accumulate skill on the job.
What about Hong Kong right now? Let's say the last 10 years, the rate of growth was its lowest since the 1950s, just 4% annually.
Well, that's...
Despite the rules have been kept, the communists haven't rocked the boat.
But remember, you get very fast growth when you're catching up, but once you start to get closer to the frontier, your growth rates inevitably slow down to be the same as the growth rates of the frontier countries.
So the higher the GDP per capita, the lower tends to be because the lower the needs of the population.
Not the needs, it's just there's no free lunch anymore.
Okay,
right now,
whatever it is,
right
you get slower growth.
You can just copy what the rest of the world is doing. When you get to the frontier, you got to become an innovator, and that's hard work.
Let's say Singapore. Last year, Singapore had a GDP per capita. This is CIA fact book statistics, which are pretty good, despite their ugly reputation as killer. But they've got a lot of good economists, and they say the U.S. last year in 2010 had a GDP per capita. Let's look at Honduras, about 4,000. Okay. The U.S. 47,000. Hong Kong 46, about the same thing. Singapore, 62. Big gap. So in Singapore, there's less of a free lunch, according to this argument. Yet, last year, the rate of economic growth of the U.S., for example, was 3%. That of Hong Kong was 4%, but that of Singapore was 15%. That is, this country has never seen a single year of 15%.
But remember, some of those fluctuations in growth rates are because of the business cycle. So when you have a sharp downturn like we had in 2008 and 9, and then a very rapid recovery from that downturn in China in particular, the economies that trade extensively with China, like Hong Kong and Singapore, benefit very dramatically when growth takes off in the recovery phase. But I can assure you that the policymakers in Singapore are planning for this slowing trend of growth because they've reached the technology frontier. They understand fully what this process is. They're trying to become innovators in areas like biotechnology, and that's hard. They're making a lot of bets. Some of them might pay off, some don't. So the growth in Singapore, they know, will not be as fast as it was during the catch-up phase.
But 15% was just breathtaking.
But that was just recovery from a very sharp slowdown.
But why didn't Western Europe recover well? Look, I studied in Switzerland. Switzerland got very clear rules, and very good rules.
But remember, that's the business cycle. Singapore also had a very sharp slowdown when China contracted. So you get fluctuations. You can have a sharp slowdown. You can have a fast recovery. But the problem, the benefit that Singapore got was because of very strong counter-cyclical policy in China. Europe and the United States have not been as aggressive in providing counter-cyclical policy, so we've been slower to recover from this recession.
It's hard to follow those arguments because Japan did invest in counter-cyclical and they didn't get fast growth in 2010. And now they're back in recession, they'll say because of the tsunami, but they had tsunamis in the 50s and the 60s and they were going at light speed back then. Yeah. So there's something awry about, isn't it true that economics is called the dismal science because it has never figured out what causes economic growth?
No, it was called the dismal science because of Malthus and his prediction that growth was impossible. Malthus, remember, said that income per person would be falling over time as population grew. So we got the name the dismal science because of a prediction that couldn't have been more wrong. It's the worst prediction in all of social science.
Okay, that prediction was wrong, but isn't it true that economics has never figured out what are the variables that cause economic growth? If they would, all nations would be out of poverty and unemployment already.
No, there's actually quite a bit of agreement about what drives this process.
But
so remember, set aside business cycle fluctuations for the moment. Think about this trend of what we call potential output. The keys to increasing potential output are adoption of new technologies and adoption of rules that improve along with the technologies. The big hurdle in turning growth on in a developing country is getting a political consensus in favor of adopting different rules. So it's politics which is the real bottleneck here, because it's political action which leads to the new rules, and the new rules can in turn generate the growth.
But this is the thing that so many things contradict. Like, for example, when China started its reforms in 1979, every single aspect of the economy was in state hands, every single one. And yet they started growing at 10% in 1979. And then countries like Latin America and others, I mean, not just with this culture. I mean, in Europe, they started applying mainstream economic policies in that same year, for example, which I think was a year that the U.S. and numerous other economies went down, whether 79, 80, that's why Jimmy Carter lost his re-election. And still, no fast growth. But China, with 100% violating every single tenet of mainstream economics, which says that the private sector drives growth, managed to get spectacular growth from the start.
But what did I say drives growth? Adoption of new technologies and adoption of better rules. Now, what did China do? One of the first things they did was adopt rules in their special economic zones, which said foreign firms could come in, those running dog capitalist foreign firms, they could come in and bring their technologies, use those technologies with Chinese workers. So it's just straight growth theory, new rules, and then adoption of foreign technologies that can flow in led to very rapid growth.
But those special economic zones, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Xiamen, and Shantou, we're talking about like not even 1,000 square kilometers out of a nation of 10 million square kilometers.
But then,
with 20% of the world population, you can't say that that teeny amount of people and physical space delivered the 10% growth for the rest of the nation in 1979 or even the 1980s.
Well, there were other factors, but remember what happened. In the beginning, no foreign firm could bring technology into China. Then China said, okay, well, you can bring technology into these special zones, and then they kept increasing the number of zones, and now technology can basically flow into the entire country. So that's exactly what a reform zone should do for you, is let a government change its rules from rules that are bad, like rules that say no entry of foreign firms, to rules that say let the foreign firms come in. We'll try and make a profit off of them. They'll try and make a profit off of us, and we'll all be better as a result.
I'm not against foreign firms. It's just that we look at statistics from, for example, this UN agency with with respect to foreign direct investment, and it shows that, for example, in the 1980s, on a per capita term, Mexico got like 5 times more foreign direct investment than China, and yet Mexico got a miserable 1% average annual rate of growth, while China got 10. How is that possible?
Okay, well, you have to look at the other aspects of the rules. So first, that China also had a very distorted agricultural sector in the 1970s, and as you know, the reforms in agriculture that unleashed private enterprise and rewards for individual producers unleashed very rapid growth in agricultural productivity and output as well. So there were a couple of changes in the rules that China used which improved.
They didn't even have private agriculture. They were just leases.
But they created private incentives so that if you worked harder as a farmer, you could keep some of the extra food
But
that
in
you
Mexico,
grew.
they had the incentive plus the private property.
But what else do they have in Mexico? They have oligopolies that have stifled competition in Mexico.
And in China, they had monopolies.
But it's a very competitive environment because of the number of different firms.
Not back then.
Yeah, but again, their agricultural sector, for example, became quickly very competitive as individuals could sell the extra output that they could keep. But again, go back to the rules in Mexico. There's not enough competition in Mexico. It's not a safe enough place to live and operate right now. It's not a place where firms can be confident about what the prospects are in the future. So Mexico has not done as good a job of creating a system of rules that can create a market economy as Mexico has done. I'm sorry, Mexico's not done as good a job as China has done.
Your father was governor of Colorado for the 3 consecutive periods, 1986, 1998, right? You earned your PhD in 1983, and you've been professor at Stanford since then?
No. My first job was at the University of Rochester, then University of Chicago, then Berkeley, then Stanford, and now I'm going to NYU.
So have you?
I can't seem to keep a job.
Okay, but they're all good jobs. The thing is that during that period, your father was governing Colorado.
Yeah.
Did you advise him?
We shared a common interest in human capital.
What was the rate
education.
of economic growth of Colorado during that period?
I didn't pay attention to its rate of growth, but I'll tell you one thing: it is one of the highest. It's one of the states that has the highest number of PhDs per capita. I think it may actually be #1 in the United States right now.
Yeah, this would be like South Korea, which has one of the highest in the nation, one of the highest in the world, a PhD. But is it the result of the government right now, or one of the 60s, the 70s, and 80s, when South Korea attained 10% economic growth? Because in the last 10 years, they only got 4% economic growth.
Okay, but remember, there's a very predictable pattern, which is that as a country gets richer, and it can't just grow by copying, its growth rate slows down. So South Korea copied early on, and now it's slowing down as it gets close to the frontier. But let me tell you what's the most important policy my father worked on in his career is improving the quality of the educational system.
That's